Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Betty Ford Alpine Gardens Evening Speaker Series, made possible by a local family foundation. And we are also thankful to all the members and those that contributed to participate in this webinar. I just wanted to remind you that the Betty Ford Alpine Gardens mission is to deepen understanding and promote conservation of alpine plants and fragile mountain environments. The Garden's 2021 theme this year is plants are an answer to the continuing effects of climate change. And the speakers in our series will address this theme. On September 8th, we'll have Dr. Tim Cruz of the Land Institute in Kansas, Adapting Farming with a Changing Climate. And Tim and his fellow researchers have been at the Land Institute have been working to develop an alternative to the current destructive agricultural practices. And I hope you'll join Tim as he discusses some of the developments there. They're advancing perennial grains and polycultural farming. On October 7th, we'll have Brad Udall, a senior water and climate research scientist at the Colorado Water Institute at Colorado State University, talking about the Colorado River and climate change. And the climate scientists agree that the Colorado River basin temperature has gone up 1 degree Celsius since the mid-20th century, and it's going to continue to rise. And the Colorado River has just gone into phase 1 of water cutbacks. So for us that depend on the Colorado River, it's especially timely to hear Brad's talk. And right now we're planning to hold these presentations in person at the Betty Ford Alpine Gardens Education Center. And tonight's talk is by Dr. Ken Tape, an ecologist with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who is working on the impact of climate warming on the Arctic ecosystem. And a lot of the plants and animals in the Arctic ecosystem we share up here in the alpine ecosystem. Some of you may remember that in 2016, Betty Ford Alpine Gardens hosted Ken's traveling exhibit called Then and Now, Changing Arctic Landscapes. And Ken has some new insights as to what's happening up there in the tundra. A lot of willows have been moving into the tundra, and behind them, the beavers who depend on willows for their food source. And so I think you'll find this talk to be pretty interesting. And if you have any questions for Ken, if you just type them in to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, after Ken's finished his talk, I will feed those questions to him. And I really hope that you'll contribute to a really exciting dialogue afterward. And we'd really like to hear from all of you. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ken. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nanette. Thanks to Nanette Kick, who you're hearing here, for organizing this lecture series, and also for bringing my traveling exhibit to the Betty Ford Alpine Gardens several years ago. It was a real honor to have it there for a spell. So just a couple nuts and bolts of the presentation stuff. Everyone can see my slide. I can see Nanette, but I can't see anyone else. Is that? I assume that's how it's supposed to be, and that's okay.
Yep, that's it, Ken.
Okay, all right, sounds good. So I'll just imagine all your beautiful faces as I'm giving this presentation. So yeah, for the last 5 or so years, I've been studying beavers of all creatures have moved into the Arctic tundra regions of Alaska, northern Canada, moved out of the boreal forest into the tundra region. So I've been studying that for the last 5 years, and that's kind of what I'm going to be studying going forward. But I spent a long time, it's part of the climate change and the landscape changes that are occurring in the Arctic. And so I did about 15 years worth of work leading up to that, related to some general changes in the Arctic. So rather than jump right in and talk about beavers, you guys are familiar with the alpine environment. I'm actually less familiar with the alpine environment. I'm from Fairbanks, Alaska. We have some alpine environments here as well, but I've done most of my research in the Arctic tundra. So this is a little bit different, but there's probably a lot of commonality I know there is between the plants and obviously just the way the look and feel of it. So, but I'm going to take a step back and go through just some of that repeat photography that was in that exhibit several years ago, to give you an idea of the changes that are occurring in the Arctic tundra, and just to build a little bit of familiarity for you with the Arctic tundra, and then I'll move into this part about beavers. But I hope to breeze through it pretty quickly. Oh, that's interesting. It's not letting me advance the slide. Let's try that. There we go. So hopefully you guys can see my pointer as well. So this is a graphic that I worked on with some graphics people at National Geographic. This was actually the fold out in the climate change issue, September 2019. So real quickly, here are some of the changes that are going on in the tundra. This is a thaw slump. So this is thawing permafrost, right? Frozen ground that's frozen year round. As it gets warmer, it's starting to thaw, and the whole soil just kind of falls apart when that happens. You got some shrinking glaciers in the back. You got tundra fires. These are ice. This is all frozen ground down here, right? It's all permafrost. This is a specific type of permafrost. This is what we call ice wedge polygonal ground, but it's just a kind of permafrost. And this ponding that you're seeing on top is a result of permafrost thaw. So this figure is trying to capture a variety of terrestrial changes all in one sort of idealized figure. So permafrost thaw, shrinking glaciers, thawing permafrost here, shrub expansion. So as the summers have gotten longer and warmer, there's a lot more shrubby vegetation on the landscape, as you would anticipate. And then also some herbivores such as moose and even beavers here have been taking advantage of the increased habitat for them, increased forage and stuff to build dams in the case of beavers. And so this was sort of an exciting figure to actually be involved in. I just like showing it because it covers a lot of these things. So we're going to breeze through that. Like I say, I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit generally about climate change in the Arctic tundra. This is mostly from Alaska, but these are true. These are generally true across the circumarctic. And yeah, I'm from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Most of this work is supported by the National Science Foundation and then some other smaller contributors. So a quick outline, I'm going to show some repeat photography showing landscape change of glaciers, vegetation, and permafrost, and then describe some more recent wildlife findings related to wildlife, and specifically we'll talk about beavers since that's what I'm most excited about these days. So one of the big changes that we observed, this was now 20 years ago, myself and Matthew Sturm repeated a whole bunch of these aerial photographs from the 50s, and the primary change that we saw was the expansion of shrubby vegetation. So these are willows. This is 1950 up in the Brooks Range. These are willows, and you can see some smaller shrubs in here. The biggest willows here are probably about 2 meters tall, maybe a little bit 2.5 meters, a little bit taller than I am, crossing that. And then if you look in 2002, all those shrubs have expanded on the landscape. And so I repeated about 300 photos across northern Alaska and demonstrated that this vegetation had changed. And of course, the obvious explanation was that the longer summers, the warmer summers had increased vegetation productivity. So you had taller, more widespread shrubby vegetation. And so I'll just show a few more examples of that. The 1 and the 2 here are the same place on the 2 photos. Again, 1950 to 2002, we just really saw an increase in that shrubby vegetation on the landscape. And these are like alders, birches, and willows, a bunch of different species. Here's another example, 1957 and 2007. This top one is taken by a gentleman named Ed Sable, and I ended up tracking these guys down. He was actually in Denver for a long time. He might even still be there. And I'd track these guys down, or they track me down, give me these old photos, and then if I were lucky, I'd go out in the field and repeat those photos. So this is the half-century repeat, 1957 to 2007. You've got permafrost thaw in this photo, and you also have, as you can see, an increase in shrubby vegetation. This is looking down on a floodplain, 1950 and 2006, and all you need to see here is, and you see this in a lot of different floodplains in northern Alaska, which is that they're stabilizing and becoming vegetated. That's probably related to permafrost underneath those floodplains. It could also be longer growing seasons, but the point is, all this bare sand and gravel that you see in this picture, a lot of that is vegetated, and it's actually vegetated with tall shrubs, the type of shrubs that that moose and beavers like. And it's not just Northern Alaska. Shrub expansion is something that's happening across the Arctic. This is a colleague of mine, J.J. Frost. These are from Russia, 1968 and 2003. So same sort of thing. And, you know, as this process went on of me sort of repeating these photos and observing changes in the Arctic, I started to think about what these changes would look like or feel like through the lens of wildlife. And of course, I started naturally with wildlife that, you know, uses shrubs for habitat. And then glaciers too. Glaciers are just great for repeat photography, right? So 1907, this is Ernest Leffingwell. 2007, this is Matt Nolan on the bottom. And I was actually standing next to him for the century repeat of this photo, which is pretty cool because it's way out of the way. And to be there, you know, a century after Leffingwell and repeat the photo, it's pretty obvious, you know, these glaciers are have just retreated way up valley, shrinking and losing. There's several hundred glaciers in the Brooks Range, and we're losing them pretty rapidly right now. We can talk more about that if you guys have questions. 1972, a gentleman named Carl Benson, who's actually a mentor of mine, and then 2007, what was that, 35 years later. You can see, so this is how thick the glaciers were at the end of the 19th century, right? That's called a trim line. You can see it in both. And so there's been a lot of, not only is the glacier shorter, which you don't see in this picture, but it's thinning, right? The glacier's getting thinner, and then you can see the glaciers across the way as well have retreated quite a bit. This is all probably familiar stuff to you guys, but I'm just trying to show you some pictures and, you know, help you get a little more familiar with the tundra landscape. By the way, a lot of those pictures are from the Arctic Refuge in Northwest Alaska, which of course has always been an area of interest and hotly debated in terms of conservation, exploration, things like that. This is actually kind of the most scary repeat photo to me. This is the Canadian High Arctic, one of those islands up in the archipelago. We got 2005 and 2013. What you're seeing here is permafrost thaw over a large scale. And they actually measured this event where they saw, you know, they actually watched the soil temperatures go above freezing, and you can see that the landscape's completely fallen apart. So permafrost, that frozen ground, is literally holding the ground together structurally. It's the interstitial stuff, and it's structural. It's ice, right? Or it's frozen soil. And so when you thaw that and you go from 2005 to 2013, it's not like if you have a couple cold years, it'll go back to looking like 2005. What that tells you when you look at this very planar surface is that you haven't had a thaw event like this one for, you know, what looks like hundreds of years or maybe thousands of years before that. So this is the type of photo that is definitely concerning. And this is a little bit hard to interpret, but this is that polygonal ground, this ice wedge polygonal ground. You're looking down on it. These are like 80 meters on a side. If you're not really familiar with the ice wedge polygonal ground, this won't make a lot of sense. But the point is that we're seeing this widespread permafrost across the Arctic. All right, so that was like the fire hose of here's how some things in the landscape of Arctic Alaska are changing. And now let's take a minute and talk about how that might look to these herbivore browsers. I'll breeze through moose and snowshoe hares pretty quickly, and then we'll talk about beavers and what makes them so special. So there's a moose in the Brooks Range at about 3:30 a.m. So this is the Northern Brooks Range, a river called the Nanashuk River. There's no moose habitat anywhere in this picture. Moose like shrubs. They like cover. They like trees too. But once you're out in the tundra, moose need these little riparian corridors, these riparian shrubs for cover and for forage. And so in a picture like this, which is fairly typical, we're running some dogs up this river into the Brooks Range. You know, you're not going to see a moose out here in the winter or likely even in the summer. So most of the Arctic is really not very favorable moose habitat. Same here. here's a whole landscape where you're not just going to see a moose standing out on the snow. If you do see a moose in this landscape, it'll be down in the shrubs. And I've got my pictures in the way here. Let me see if I can move that. So I set up a bunch of game cams at one point and caught thousands of caribou and ptarmigan migrating through, which was really cool. And I was sort of looking at some separate things. But here are a couple moose. And this is where the moose spend a bunch of time hanging out in this patch, doing some sleeping down here. This was the best view I got of them for like over 12 hours of footage as they were leaving. They like to be buried in these shrubs. And this is, you can kind of think of this as like the minimum amount that a moose needs to survive in an Arctic environment. And even here, this patch is not big enough. They've got to keep moving in an environment like this. So just from a pictorial standpoint, you see, if you look at this picture here, 1957 to 2007, you can start to imagine how that shrub expansion that we demonstrated with repeat photography, and that you've now observed how that shrub expansion could be conducive to moose leaving the boreal forest and finding sufficient shrub habitat in the tundra. And so I started thinking, well, wait a minute, if this shrub expansion thing is really happening, if I go back a century, will there be moose in the tundra, for example, in 1900? And the answer is no. So here is northern Alaska. Fairbanks is right here, down that corner. And the green line here is tree line, right? So everything that is south of that green line is boreal forest. And the tundra is out here. And the tundra, a lot of people don't realize, the tundra wraps around the western side of Alaska. So this is all tundra in here. And I started piecing together moose distribution from a variety of published and anecdotal sources for the last 150 years. And what you see is that, sure enough, moose distribution has moved into the tundra, 1880, 1920, 1950. Moose have moved into the tundra during the last century. And we think that that's in response to this increase in their shrub habitat. Snowshoe hares have actually done something similar. So snowshoe hares also have a similar dependence on shrub habitat, on shrubs for forage and for cover. So they need that shrubby habitat. We believe that they have also increased their numbers in the tundra. But as with any good ecological problem, it's pretty complicated. In the case of moose, hunting patterns have changed a lot in the last 150 years. So is it possible that the predominantly native people that were in these areas of northern and western Alaska could have extirpated moose from that region, and only when that hunting slowed down during the 20th century did moose recolonize this area? So our idea is still that that this habitat expansion, shrub habitat expansion, is the primary explanation for what we're seeing. But it's an interesting idea, and hunting has probably played some role, and we haven't completely figured that out. So moose, snowshoe hare, we think they're moving into the tundra following increases in their shrub habitat, which is related to warming. I think most of the pieces fit together pretty well. And then there's beavers. And so I started thinking about, all right, well, moose, snowshoe hare, and wrote some papers and tried to make some progress on this idea of wildlife moving out of the boreal forest into the Arctic tundra. And I started to think about, well, what's the next creature that's going to wander out of the boreal forest? And when I stumbled upon beavers, it was pretty exciting because, there's beavers in the lower right corner there. It was pretty exciting because, unlike any wildlife, beavers really leave a mark on the Earth's surface. They leave a mark on the Earth's surface, and it's one that is so profound that you can see it from space. Which means that, and this was kind of the light bulb moment for me, was that I could map the potential movement of beavers into the Arctic tundra by looking at the formation or disappearance of beaver ponds in satellite imagery through time, and then back to aerial photography. So it would be a way of mapping beaver engineering in the tundra over time. And that was pretty exciting. So some fun facts about beavers before we get into the research that we're doing. This is from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game website. Beaver is found throughout most forested portions of the state. That would be the state of Alaska. That's true. They're also found in the Arctic tundra, as it turns out. To survive, beavers must be assured of 2 or 3 feet of water year-round. Water provides a refuge from enemies and a way to float and transport heavy objects such as branches and logs for food and construction. Food for winter use must be stored in underwater food caches during autumn. The life of a beaver colony is governed largely by food supply. I'm not sure if that's really true in the tundra, but one important point is they don't hibernate. It's amazing. They hang out in that lodge with their family, and they swim out and they eat their cache for 7 to 8 months. That probably 7 to 8 months in a tundra environment. Their feet are not adapted. They don't have fur on their feet, so they can't be out in the snow and ice much. And so they're a pretty interesting creature. And of course, everyone has stories about some beaver dam or crazy beaver engineering that they've witnessed. But so here's what it looks like in this old aerial photography and satellite imagery. It's confusing that this is red. The 1980 image, it's color infrared aerial photography. So color infrared just means that everything you see that is red there is actually green. It's green tundra. It's a stream flowing right to left across it. The stream is maybe a little wider than my office, kind of a small stream, probably not boatable, for example, in 1980. And by 2019, you can see the beavers have just completely changed it. We've got 100 meter and longer dams, big long dams. These are giant beaver ponds. All the black is water. So all the black, this is just, it's taken this stream and turned it into a wetland. And everyone has experiences of sort of seeing, this is what has happened in the Western United States as beavers have returned to these areas. It's particularly striking though, because these areas are underlain with permafrost. And when you put a pond on the landscape, you inundate the tundra landscape, you begin to thaw permafrost because that pond traps and stores heat better than the pre-existing tundra vegetation. So it actually conducts that heat down to the ground and thaws permafrost. And that's one of the big concerns, but really it's just whole level ecosystem change. Fish, aquatic food webs, shrubs, everything changes. Water temperature, hydrology. So if we think about that last slide, I mapped, in the last couple of years, I mapped about a little over 12,000 beaver ponds in western and northwestern Alaska. So here again is Northwest Alaska. The gray area is boreal forest. So we're mostly studying in the tundra right now just because it's a manageable area. Gray area is the boreal forest. We're working out here, and this is pond density. So 0, if you have 0 ponds, it's this royal, fairly dark blue. All of the North Slope of Alaska, including the Arctic, most of the tundra part of the Arctic Refuge, has 0 ponds. Beavers have not gotten there yet. The red line is actually the continental divide of the Brooks Range, and beavers are at the continental divide of the Brooks Range. They just have to swim downstream and find suitable habitat, and they will change these streams one by one into wetlands like the one you saw in the last example. So the yellow areas, for example, Nome is down here, Nome, Alaska, where the Iditarod ends, right? Nome is here. We just did some field work out in this area. You can see there's quite a lot of ponds out there. And the number of ponds has doubled in the last 20 years. And if you go back to 1949 to 1955 imagery, it doesn't cover all the areas, but it covers a lot of these areas. And I can tell you that there are 0 beaver ponds in that 1949 to 1955 imagery. So it's pretty striking. We do all this detecting change in the Arctic landscape, and it's really striking when you start to see how these stream valleys are transitioning from little free-flowing streams to wetlands, and just thinking about how the ecosystem will change. And so the local cartoonist in Fairbanks is this guy, Jamie Smith, and he actually authored this, he drew this cartoon in 2001. Beavers is one of his favorite animals that he writes about, draws cartoons with a lot. And this is just a perfect prophecy, because, this is the situation that is playing out across the tundra regions of Alaska by the hundreds. There are beavers looking out into unengineered landscapes. I don't want to say pristine, because I think that might have the wrong connotation. And then they're going forth by themselves with families and completely altering these lowland permafrost ecosystems. So I always really like this cartoon. And just to zoom in and give you an idea, I mean, this is Kotzebue in northwestern Alaska. That's the village of Kotzebue right here. These are now dams that are actually mapped for this particular paper that we did a couple of years ago. In 2002, you have 2 dams. By 2019, 98 dams in that same little region. If we back up and look at a little bit larger area, this is just 2010 to 2019, 94, you see 94 dams in 2010, 409 dams in 2019. So you can really see that these guys come into a new area, guys and gals come into a new area and really transform the lowland tundra ecosystems. And this is what it looks like. And this is actually more of an alpine tundra. This is sort of like an Arctic alpine tundra along the Denali Highway, not the Denali Park Road, but it's similar to that. It's the Denali Highway. So this is just south of the Alaska Range. We're up at maybe 4,000 feet. But still, latitude, we're probably at, 63 degrees latitude. We're still up there quite a ways. Anyway, this is what a beaver pond looks like. This was a little stream at some point, and you're probably looking at a 2-meter head between the pond here and the outlet here. But yeah, just to give you an idea of what these things look like. Now here, see this entire picture, I actually took a boat and mucked my way around this whole scene, came floating down the river. See, there's a dam here, there's a dam here, dam here, there's a dam here, there's a log, there's dams everywhere. This whole area is a beaver pond. There's all these dams in here. This is a beaver pond. This is a beaver pond. There's a bunch of dams back in these channels. Basically, almost all the water you see here is being stored on the landscape by beaver engineering. And this is the transition that we're seeing across the tundra regions of Alaska now, and really over the last 30 years, depending on where you are. And I wanted to throw one picture. So I haven't talked too much about implications, because we've just got to the point where we've mapped the scale of this issue. And we really are at the hypothesis stage of how these beaver ponds are really going to affect the landscape. All of what you're seeing in this picture, this is all what we call thermokarst. It's permafrost thaw. And as the landscape has collapsed and just fallen apart, this is what's left. And it's related to, there was beavers flooded a large part of this area. They're still obviously there's not a lake here right now, but they're rebuilding their dam somewhere down here. But this is the type of thing that the beaver does. It's just super dramatic. They get in there, they change the hydrology. When you change the hydrology, you thaw permafrost. And this is the landscape that results from beaver engineering. And this is really what's different than the lower, what we call the lower 48. When beavers enter temperate ecosystems, they do a lot of really good things, right? Increasing the groundwater, trapping water on the landscape. That's a good thing in the West these days, but up in the Arctic, it's different. That trapping of water actually leads to thawing permafrost and a creation of what I would call a kind of oasis. So as with the moose, but even more so with beavers, we know that there's more unfrozen water in winter. We know that, and the unfrozen water winter is a big deal, because if the ice freezes all the way down, the beaver's not going to survive. They need unfrozen water in winter, both in the streams and in their pond. So we know that that's increasing as a result of climate warming. And of course, we know that there's more of this shrubby vegetation for them to harvest and store up for the winter. But the other thing is that winter itself is shorter. The beaver's bottleneck, as you can imagine, is like those first couple of weeks of April where, they're out of food and they're just dying to get out there, but, winter's still going on. So the fact that winter ends, 2 to 4 weeks earlier than it did a century ago is really significant. That's a significant positive for them. But of course, the other factor is that, for the same reason that beavers return to the rest of the conterminous United States, they're rebounding from being over-trapped a couple hundred years ago. And that process is still playing out in Alaska. They're rebounding from over-trapping. In Alaska, it was, that trapping was still going heavy 120 years ago. So it really hasn't been that long. And it remains unclear exactly how this rebound from over-trapping versus this increase in their habitat is contributing to the colonization that we're seeing. But we're largely at this point focused on implications. We're not so worried about the driver, although there's a lot of insights associated with that. So that's all I have. I think that's everything. This is a picture from the side of the Chalitna River in Alaska. This is a beaver pond at sunrise. It's about 4 a.m. And it's a picture I took with my drone, actually. That's a pretty old beaver dam and beaver pond there. But so thanks again to Nanette Kick and the Betty Ford Alpine Gardens for hosting this talk. And thank you very much for your attention. And I'd be curious if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. I love the photos. They're great. And I'm just waiting to see if anyone has any questions. I'm just wondering if you have any idea about the percentage of the permafrost that you think has disappeared up there on the North Slope area?
That's a good question. I don't think I could put it in terms of a percentage, but it's a completely fair question. I just don't think I have an answer to that. Most of the permafrost is warming and some of it is thawing. But beyond that, I don't think I could put a number on it and say. The other thing is it's a difficult question because it's thick. It's like it's thousands.
Yeah.
It's 1 to 2,000 feet thick. So, a lot of it's still frozen, but what you see is a lot of that thermokarst terrain, that, stuff looking like that. That's what we just as a community need to watch out for, I think.
And one of the things that I also have read about is that the willows are also, and the more shrubby vegetation are covering up the lichens, which are a major food source for the caribou. So how do you think that the shrubs are affecting their food source?
That's a great question. I think it's problematic for caribou. It's just like you say, when shrubs went out, lichens and understory forbs, I think are probably the losers, and thus our caribou as well. But caribou are complicated. They migrate, and so I don't even know if they could tell you right now what sort of the bottleneck is for caribou. If it's forage availability or something surrounding parturition, calving. But I would agree that I would say with shrub expansion, lichens are going to lose out, and that's like primary forage for caribou. You said you like the photos. I've got some more photos I can buzz through. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, someone is asking about do the beavers have any predators up there on the North Slope?
Great question. Yeah, they do. And so bears, wolverines, wolves, maybe lynx, probably coyote. So those are the predators. And it's a great question, because what's probably happening is that as those beavers, as that new food source for those predators moves into the tundra, I've got to think that a number of those predators are gonna thrive, related to that. And what's interesting about these types of questions, just from a sort of philosophical point of view, is, beavers mostly are helping new species come to the Arctic. These beaver ponds end up being physical and biological oases where new species can gain a foothold in the tundra. So there's a lot of, so in some ways you look at it in that sense, it's a good thing. The permafrost thaw is probably a bad thing. You're releasing a bunch of greenhouse gases and things like that. And I think you have there are probably endemic Arctic species, thinking of certain fish, for example, and plant species like lichens and forbs, right, that are losing out. And so I think that's, from a conservation standpoint, that's something to be a little bit concerned about.
Yes, one of the questions was about, do we have an increase in plant diversity because of the beavers? And I would say, well, I'll let you talk about that.
It's a great hypothesis. I would guess so. I would say increase in plant diversity and aquatic biodiversity. Just because and the other thing is, you're dealing with, I haven't mentioned it, but this is a temperature limited environment, right? It's too cold for most stuff. So that's what keeps the biodiversity low. And so when you add a beaver pond, well, suddenly you just took a little stream that freezes to the bottom or nearly freezes the bottom. And now you've got deep, warm water that's being stored in that pond. And it's a warmer pond. It's kind of like a heat island. So that's our working hypothesis, is that you do have more biodiversity around these ponds, and thus the Arctic changes, right? I talked about 12,000 beaver ponds. So one pond or a little miniature wetland at a time, you start to think of how the Arctic is changing on a larger scale by dotting it with these oases.
Yeah, and then we have a question about how it's affecting the Native Americans, and maybe in terms of transportation and other ways.
No, I think that's a great question. The Native Alaskans are concerned about beavers, mostly because of impacts to fish. And I think the perception, as it was in the Western U.S. when beavers came back to the Western U.S., was initially that, beavers block fish movement, and so they must be bad. Of course, the Native Alaskans up here, they have a more nuanced picture of it than that. But that's where the concern arises. And we have one project right now that's trying to get at fish. But to be honest, we had 2 years of field work canceled due to COVID. And so that project hasn't gone very far. But yeah, impacts to fish is a big one, because fish is the second resource for most of these villages. And there's like 15 villages just in that region where I showed you the map pond. They've all observed this in real time. It's not news to them, right? They have observed the influx of beavers starting as early as 1970 in some areas, and as recently as the last 5 years. But yeah, impacts to fish is a big one. And then boat access, just like you said, boat access to hunting sites and traditional hunting areas. So those are and then water quality. Suddenly you're hunting. Now, beavers aren't the only animal that carry giardia, but that's one of the concerns. Great question.
There was a question about how about increasing severity of storms up there in the Arctic due to changing climate, and I know, and I've of course heard about the fact that your atmosphere is taller now, so now you can have thunderstorms up there, whereas before you never could develop thunderstorms because the troposphere was shorter. And maybe you can talk about more things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not super knowledgeable about storms and meteorology, except I will say this, you know, the reason the Arctic tundra wraps around the western side of Alaska is because it's coastal. And that sea ice lingering into summer is what prevents summer from really getting started in the tundra. So that's why the tundra is there, this strip next to the coast, is because sea ice lingers. And as the sea ice goes away earlier, that is just an additional feedback that creates more warming, because you don't have this white reflective surface next to town, right? Like Nome, you don't have this white reflective surface lasting into June anymore. It's going way earlier. And so all that heat, instead of getting reflected back off the sea ice, gets absorbed. And of course, the storms come in that would have been blocked by sea ice. But I don't really have a great answer to that question, except to say that if you live in a place that's near sea ice, climate change is exacerbated because the sea ice is really disappearing in the Bering Strait.
Well, so how about the mosquitoes? Are they getting worse?
We had a horrible mosquito year. So I'm going to show you guys a few more pictures just for fun, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And I've got a mosquito movie down here that may or may not work. This is what the tundra looks like in August on the North Slope. These are mostly old pictures. This is a fog bow from the Arctic coast. Bunch of caribou in November. Oh, that's a picture from the Brooks Range. Kind of where they want to put that mine, the Ambler Road. You may have heard about it. They're trying to put a mine in the Southern Brooks Range. It's right in this area. Ptarmigan, another one of the species that is benefiting from shrub expansion. There's moose. There's a melting glacier in the Alaska Range. You probably see those ice halos in Colorado as well from time to time. Muskox, Pleistocene remnant. You can still be seen roaming the Alaska tundra. It's pretty close to my backyard. It's kind of what 40 below looks like. That's a forest fire from a couple of years ago. That's an old picture from Greenland. Oh, aurora pictures. That's my backyard. You can see the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper right there.
Oh, yeah.
That's a pretty big aurora when you think about how big the Big Dipper is. Gives you some sense of the scale of that thing. All right, I'm going to burn through a lot of fieldbook pictures really quick and get to my last one. Ah, there it is. So this is my truth in advertising video. Okay, you guys ready? And I'm chewing something. I'm eating my lunch underneath the screen, right? But that's me 2-3 years ago. I've got to say, that's about as bad as I've ever seen it. But just so you don't get any glamorous ideas about coming up and doing field work.
I have been up there during mosquito infestation season, and I can definitely vouch for what it's like.
Good.
I did have one question about what kind of camera you use.
I shoot just a Canon DSLR. I shoot a Canon 6D. It went for a swim last fall. After 20 years of taking it down rivers, I got some water in a bag, and so I took a little break from photography after that. But yeah, I use Canon 6D with a couple nice L series lenses, and then I shoot a Mavic 2 drone, and the drone just changed everything. I don't know. It breathed some life in my photography, getting to see things from a new perspective.
Do you attach an iPhone camera to it, or does it come with its own camera, the drone?
It comes with its own camera. I mean, you cannot believe the technology on these things anymore. I'm not, what is it, a technophile? I'm not a very technologically inclined person. So I waited until drones had great cameras, and I figured a dummy like me can't screw this up. And so far I have not. I haven't crashed it or anything like that. But yeah, they have amazing cameras.
Well, I was just going to ask my audience if they want to add any other questions before we let you go. Looks like it's pretty quiet out there.
Okay.
I think the photography was great, and I really appreciate the fact that you're actually capturing data in real time. You know, there's no place that's being affected more by climate change than the tundra right now. And up here in the Alpine, it's the same way. We are experiencing it worse than anywhere. But I think, you know, at first, especially your older exhibit, climate change is a little bit more controversial, and you had some really good data. I think times have changed, and most people accept climate change, but having real data is the key to you know, keeping track of what's happening.
I agree.
Yeah, and I think mostly what we're getting now is just thank you so much, Ken, for talking to us from Alaska, and we'll keep in touch.
Yes, thank you all for listening. That was really fun. It's my pleasure.
Thanks.
Nanette.
Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.